The Economy of the American Colonies, Tobacco, Cotton, and Trade, Part 1. Imagine the scent of freshly cut tobacco leaves drying under the hot Virginia sun. The year is 1619. The English colony of Jamestown has survived famine, conflict, and disease, and now, it finally finds something worth more than gold in the New World soil. That something is tobacco. Tobacco would become the lifeblood of early American commerce, the green gold that fueled England's colonial ambitions. But behind that sweet smoke was a darker story, one of relentless labor, human bondage, and a transatlantic web of trade that would shape not only the economy of the colonies but also the conscience of a nation yet unborn. In the early 1600s, the American colonies were not founded as a grand, unified nation, they were fragile outposts, scattered experiments in survival. Each colony had its own identity, its own geography, and its own way of making a living. The northern colonies, like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, were rocky and cold, forcing settlers to depend on the sea, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, were fertile and diverse, producing wheat, livestock, and iron. But the southern colonies, that's where the real cash crops were born. The soil of Virginia, Maryland, and later the Carolinas was rich and deep, perfect for growing tobacco. And once the world developed a taste for it, there was no turning back. Tobacco didn't just make money, it made fortunes. By the 1620s, ship after ship carried barrels of the dried leaves across the Atlantic to England. There, it was sold, taxed, and consumed by a society that had grown addicted to the exotic luxury from the New World. For England, the colonies became a cash machine. For the colonists, it was a ticket to prosperity, if they could survive long enough to harvest it. But there was one problem: labor. Tobacco required immense, backbreaking work, clearing fields, planting seedlings, tending to the plants, cutting, drying, and packing them into heavy hogsheads for shipment. In the beginning, English colonists tried to do it themselves, but the work was grueling and endless. So they turned to a system called indentured servitude, poor men and women from England who agreed to work for several years in exchange for passage to America. Many dreamed of freedom and land at the end of their contract, but for most, that dream turned into hardship and death. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and yellow fever cut through the labor camps, and the promise of freedom was often replaced by a grave in the Virginia soil. Still, the tobacco economy grew. By 1640, Virginia alone was exporting millions of pounds of it every year. The scent of drying tobacco became the smell of survival, and ambition. But as the 17th century marched on, something changed. Indentured servants became harder to find. England's economy improved, and fewer people were desperate enough to risk the deadly voyage. Plantation owners began to look elsewhere, across the Atlantic, to Africa. The year 1619 marked a turning point. A Dutch ship arrived at Jamestown carrying a handful of Africans, the first recorded enslaved people in English America. At first, the system was unclear. Some of these early Africans were treated like servants who could eventually earn freedom. But over the decades, laws hardened. Skin color became the mark of bondage, and slavery became the foundation of the Southern economy. By the 1700s, enslaved Africans were the backbone of colonial agriculture, not just in tobacco fields, but in rice plantations in the Carolinas and indigo farms along the coast. Generations of men, women, and children lived and died under the lash, producing the wealth that built colonial mansions and fueled the empire. And while tobacco was king, new crops were rising to challenge its throne. Cotton, that soft, white fiber, was already known in the world, but in the early colonial years, it was not yet dominant. The southern colonies lacked the technology to clean and process it efficiently. Still, some farmers experimented with it, planting small patches between rows of tobacco or corn. In the Carolinas and Georgia, another crop, rice, became a major export, grown in swampy fields by enslaved Africans who brought with them knowledge of rice cultivation from West Africa. Alongside it, indigo, a plant that produced deep blue dye, became another lucrative product for export to Europe's textile markets. But cotton, though still secondary, was quietly spreading. Its time would come, but that's a story for later in our journey. By the 18th century, the colonies were part of a vast system known as the triangular trade, a commercial network that linked North America, Europe, and Africa. Ships from New England carried rum and manufactured goods to Africa. There, traders exchanged them for enslaved Africans. Those Africans were shipped, often under horrific conditions, across the Atlantic to the Americas. In return, ships loaded with tobacco, sugar, and later cotton sailed back to Europe, completing the triangle. This trade was not just about goods, it was about power. Every barrel of tobacco, every bale of cotton, every enslaved person sold at auction, added to the wealth of merchants in London, Boston, and Charleston. The colonies grew richer, but they also grew more dependent, on European markets, African labor, and the sea that connected them all. In port cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, trade flourished. Docks buzzed with activity, sailors shouting, ropes creaking, crates being hoisted from ships. Merchants grew wealthy dealing in imported goods, spices, textiles, sugar, tea, and tools. Artisans and craftsmen thrived, blacksmiths, coopers, carpenters, and shipwrights. The colonies developed their own class of businessmen, many of whom would later become the revolutionaries who challenged British rule. But in the South, wealth was measured differently. There, the plantation aristocracy reigned supreme, men who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved workers. Their wealth wasn't in trade, but in land and labor. They built grand homes, imported fine furniture from London, and lived like European nobility, all on the backs of human suffering. This economic difference, between the merchant-driven North and the plantation South, would come to define much of American history. The North built ships, traded goods, and developed towns. The South grew crops and relied on slavery. Both prospered, but in fundamentally different ways. Even within the colonies, these differences created tension. Northerners sometimes looked down on the Southern gentry as idle and cruel. Southerners, in turn, saw Northern merchants as greedy and hypocritical, profiting indirectly from slavery through trade. And yet, both depended on each other. The Northern ships carried Southern crops. The Southern planters bought Northern goods. The colonies were bound together by commerce, and by contradictions. To the British Crown, the colonies were not independent economies, they were parts of a greater machine. England followed a philosophy known as mercantilism, which said that colonies existed to enrich the mother country. The colonies could grow raw materials, tobacco, cotton, timber, rice, but they were expected to buy finished goods from England. Laws like the Navigation Acts made sure of that. These acts required colonial goods to be shipped on English vessels and sold only to English markets. It was a system designed to keep the colonies dependent, and England wealthy. But it also bred resentment. Colonial merchants saw opportunities being stolen by distant politicians. Plantation owners grumbled about taxes and trade restrictions. Slowly, the seeds of economic rebellion began to grow, long before the political ones would spark revolution. Behind every thriving colonial port and every field of waving tobacco stood countless human stories, of labor, endurance, and pain. Enslaved Africans, indentured servants, and small farmers all contributed to the rise of America's first economy, yet few reaped its rewards. It was an economy built on ambition and inequality, a mirror of the empire that created it. The story of colonial America's economy isn't just about money or crops. It's about how people, power, and profit intertwined across oceans. From the muddy banks of the James River to the crowded docks of Boston Harbor, every bale, every barrel, every coin told a story of opportunity and exploitation. And as we'll see in Part 2, the world of trade would expand, new markets, new products, and new conflicts. Cotton would rise to dominance, fortunes would be made and lost, and the question of freedom, both economic and human, would become impossible to ignore. Part 2, From Tobacco Fields to Cotton Kingdom. By the mid-1700s, the 13 colonies had matured. They were no longer fragile outposts clinging to survival, they were bustling societies connected by roads, rivers, and trade routes that stretched across the Atlantic. Tobacco still reigned in Virginia and Maryland, but whispers of another crop were beginning to stir: cotton. Before the Revolution, few could have imagined how a simple white fiber would one day transform America's destiny. Yet, the seeds of that transformation were already being sown. Colonial merchants in New England had turned seafaring into an art. Their ships carried salted fish to the Caribbean, lumber to Britain, and rum to Africa. In return came sugar, molasses, and enslaved human beings, the grim engine of the triangular trade. Every voyage meant profit. Every barrel of sugar or gallon of rum told a story of labor and risk. Boston, Newport, and Providence became maritime powerhouses. Their harbors echoed with the clang of shipbuilders' hammers and the chatter of dockworkers loading cargo bound for distant ports. In the middle colonies, prosperity took a different shape. Pennsylvania's fertile valleys produced wheat and livestock that fed both the colonies and Europe. Philadelphia, the Athens of America, buzzed with printers, bankers, and craftsmen. Trade was the heartbeat of the city. Benjamin Franklin himself was as much a businessman as a philosopher. Meanwhile, the South continued to expand its plantations. Tobacco wealth built brick mansions along the James River. Rice and indigo enriched the Carolina coast. But the Southern dream had limits: soils were exhausting, labor was costly, and markets could shift overnight. Planters were always hunting for the next miracle crop. When revolution erupted in 1775, it wasn't only a fight for political freedom, it was also about economic control. The colonies were tired of British trade restrictions that dictated where they could sell, what they could buy, and how much tax they owed for the privilege. During the war, colonial trade nearly collapsed. British blockades strangled ports, and paper money lost its value. Yet even in hardship, Americans found ways to keep commerce alive, smuggling through the Caribbean, trading with France and Spain, and supplying the Continental Army with homegrown goods. When independence finally came, a new question loomed: how would this young republic rebuild its economy? In the 1780s, America was still overwhelmingly rural. Cities like New York and Philadelphia were growing, but the vast majority of citizens lived on farms. To many, land meant freedom, the chance to prosper by the work of one's own hands. Tobacco remained vital, but its dominance was fading. Soil depletion in Virginia pushed planters southward, searching for fresh ground. Rice still thrived in coastal Carolina, yet it required enormous labor and capital. Indigo profits waned as European dyes improved. The South needed something new. Then came cotton. Cotton had been grown in small amounts since colonial times, but separating its sticky seeds from the fluffy fiber was a nightmare. A worker could clean only a pound or two per day by hand. In 1793, a young inventor named Eli Whitney changed everything. His cotton gin, short for engine, could clean 50 pounds of cotton in a single day. Suddenly, what had been a tedious crop became a goldmine. The effect was explosive. Across the South, planters tore up old tobacco fields and planted cotton instead. Towns that had once been sleepy backwaters turned into booming centers of trade. New Orleans, Savannah, and Charleston became gateways for the white gold that fed the mills of England and New England alike. Cotton was no longer just a crop, it was a revolution. And its success rested on an old, cruel foundation: slavery. The 1780s had seen some hope that slavery might fade away. In the North, abolition movements were gathering momentum. Many believed that liberty and slavery could not coexist in the same republic. But the cotton boom reversed that optimism. Enslaved labor became more valuable than ever. Families were torn apart and sold southward to work in the new cotton frontier: Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. The slave population of the United States tripled between 1790 and 1830. Cotton exports soared from just 500,000 pounds in 1790 to more than 100 million by 1830. The American South became the world's largest supplier, feeding the spinning machines of Britain's Industrial Revolution. Every yard of cloth woven in Manchester or Lowell had roots in a southern field. Cotton wealth built cities, banks, and shipping empires. But it also deepened the moral wound of slavery, a contradiction at the heart of the American experiment. While the South grew cotton, the North began to weave it. Water-powered textile mills sprang up along the rivers of New England, in Lowell, Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and beyond. Young women, often farmers' daughters, worked long hours at the looms, turning bales of southern cotton into finished cloth. Northern factories needed southern cotton. Southern planters needed northern credit, ships, and insurance. Even northern merchants who despised slavery profited indirectly from it. At the same time, the North's economy diversified. Ironworks, tanneries, and small machine shops laid the groundwork for an industrial nation. Banks and insurance companies emerged to finance this new economy. America was beginning to change, from a scattered agrarian society into a complex web of agriculture, industry, and commerce. By the early 1800s, American ports were among the busiest in the world. In New York, towering masts filled the harbor like a forest of wood and canvas. Merchant ships carried American goods across the Atlantic, cotton to England, tobacco to France, furs to Russia, whale oil to lamps in London. In return came luxury goods, machinery, and investment capital. Merchants became celebrities of capitalism. Names like Astor, Girard, and Brown were synonymous with wealth and influence. They financed trade routes that stretched from the Caribbean to Canton. Their fortunes built mansions on Wall Street and endowed universities that still stand today. Yet even as America's ships crisscrossed the oceans, the nation's prosperity remained fragile, tied to global markets, weather, and war. Cotton and tobacco made men rich, but they also made them reckless. Planters borrowed heavily to expand their lands, using enslaved people as collateral. When European demand dipped or prices fell, entire fortunes collapsed. The Panic of 1819, America's first major financial crisis, revealed the danger of over-reliance on exports. Banks failed, farms were foreclosed, and unemployment soared. The new republic learned an old truth: prosperity built on speculation can vanish overnight. Still, the lure of profit was irresistible. The cotton frontier pushed ever westward, devouring Native American lands in Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond. The federal government's policies, including forced removals like the Trail of Tears, cleared the way for new plantations. The American economy was expanding, but its moral debt was growing too. By the 1830s, the divide between North and South was unmistakable. The North looked forward, toward industry, immigration, and innovation. The South looked backward, to land, labor, and tradition. Northern cities swelled with factories and free laborers, Southern wealth remained concentrated in the hands of a few. In the North, work meant wages. In the South, work meant bondage. And yet, each side needed the other. Ships built in Maine carried cotton grown in Georgia. Banks in New York financed plantations in Mississippi. The threads of commerce bound them together, even as the threads of ideology pulled them apart. America's leaders understood the stakes. Thomas Jefferson called agriculture the backbone of the nation, yet he relied on British trade for survival. Alexander Hamilton envisioned factories and finance as the path to independence. Their debate, between farming and industry, state and market, would shape the country's destiny for generations. As canals and railroads appeared, linking inland farms to coastal ports, the economy began to hum with new energy. The cotton gin had ignited a southern boom, but steam power and machinery were birthing an industrial revolution of their own in the North. The United States was stepping onto the world stage, not just as a political experiment, but as an economic powerhouse in the making. The story of America's colonial and early national economy is one of connection and contradiction, of invention and exploitation. Tobacco had opened the door. Cotton had turned the key. And trade, across rivers, oceans, and human lives, had bound it all together. But prosperity came at a price. The same forces that built America's wealth would soon threaten to tear it apart. In Part 3, we'll explore how the Cotton Empire reached its zenith, and how the relentless drive for profit and power set the stage for a conflict that would redefine the nation itself. Part 3, The Cotton Kingdom and the Road to the Civil War. By the mid-1800s, the United States had grown from a line of struggling colonies into a continental power. The cotton fields of the South stretched for miles, and the textile mills of the North roared day and night. Ships carried American goods to every corner of the globe. On the surface, it was an age of triumph, of invention, expansion, and wealth. But beneath the prosperity lay deep cracks, two economies, two visions of America, and one question that refused to die: could a nation built on freedom survive while half of it was enslaved? In the early decades of the 19th century, cotton had become more than a crop, it was an empire. The fertile lands of the Deep South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, produced nearly three-quarters of the world's cotton by 1850. Every thread of fabric woven in Manchester, Liverpool, or Lowell began in an American field, planted by enslaved hands. Cotton exports made up more than half of the nation's total trade value. It was, quite literally, the fabric of the American economy. Plantations grew into vast enterprises, thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved laborers, millions in profits. A single bale of cotton could travel from a Mississippi riverboat to a New Orleans dock, across the Atlantic to England, and return as fine cloth sold in northern cities. The cycle seemed unstoppable. Southern planters called cotton their white gold. Newspapers boasted that cotton is king. And for a time, they were right. But this kingdom was powered by suffering. By 1860, nearly 4 million men, women, and children lived in bondage in the American South. They planted, picked, and packed the cotton that enriched their masters. From sunrise to sunset, they labored under the threat of the whip. Children were born into slavery, families were separated and sold. The cotton economy consumed human lives as if they were fuel for a machine that never rested. And yet, in defiance of that cruelty, enslaved people preserved their humanity. They sang in the fields, prayed in secret gatherings, and passed down stories of hope. Their resistance, quiet and unbroken, would become the moral heartbeat of the American story. While the South harvested cotton, the North was transforming. Steam engines hissed in factories. Ironworks clanged with the sound of progress. Canals and railroads crisscrossed the landscape, linking farms to cities, ports to markets. New York City became the financial capital of the young nation. Wall Street bankers financed cotton shipments, while insurers protected slave ships and cargo. Northern merchants sold the tools, clothing, and goods used on plantations. Even abolitionist states were tangled in the web of slavery's profits. The Industrial Revolution in America was born from Southern cotton. Mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, and Manchester, New Hampshire, spun thread day and night. Textile towns grew, filled with immigrant workers chasing a new kind of freedom, the freedom of wages instead of whips. But moral contradictions ran deep. How could a republic built on liberty profit from slavery? How could a nation that declared all men are created equal sell human beings as property? The cotton trade stretched across oceans. British merchants depended on American cotton to feed their factories. French, Dutch, and Spanish investors poured money into southern ports. Cotton linked the world in an invisible chain, connecting African slave markets, American plantations, European factories, and global consumers. Every empire depended on it, and every empire feared losing it. When Southerners spoke of secession, they believed the world would side with them, that King Cotton would rule diplomacy as surely as it ruled trade. They could not imagine a world where the cotton stopped flowing. As the cotton frontier pushed west, so did conflict. Native American nations were forced from their lands through war and removal. The Trail of Tears cleared millions of acres for new plantations. In Congress, every new territory raised the same burning question: would it be free or slave? The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each was an attempt to balance an impossible equation. The nation was growing richer, but also angrier. Railroads and telegraphs were shrinking distances, but minds and hearts were drifting farther apart. The South saw the North as meddling moralists who wanted to destroy their way of life. The North saw the South as a land trapped in a brutal past. Trade that once connected them now exposed their divide. By the 1830s and 1840s, a wave of reform and abolitionism swept through the North. Newspapers like The Liberator, edited by William Lloyd Garrison, demanded immediate emancipation. Former slaves like Frederick Douglass electrified audiences with speeches that exposed the hypocrisy of freedom for some. In the South, planters doubled down, defending slavery as not just necessary, but natural. They argued that their economy, and even civilization itself, depended on it. The debate spilled into churches, schools, and homes. Economists, politicians, and preachers all took sides. And with every harvest, every shipment, every profit, the moral tension grew heavier, like storm clouds gathering over the horizon. While human bondage persisted, America's material progress accelerated. Invention after invention reshaped the nation: the steamboat, the telegraph, the railroad. The Erie Canal opened trade between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes, turning New York into the empire's greatest port. Factories mechanized production, cities swelled with immigrants seeking work. A middle class was rising, and with it came new ideas: capitalism, free enterprise, self-made success. But in the cotton fields, little changed. Progress and oppression existed side by side. The same country that built railroads to the Pacific kept millions in chains. The economic miracle of the United States was built on an unspoken contradiction: prosperity for some, bondage for others. By the 1850s, cotton had made the South immensely wealthy, yet dangerously dependent. Nearly every dollar of Southern profit came from a single crop. Few factories, few railroads, little diversity. The North, by contrast, was industrializing at lightning speed. This imbalance was more than economic, it was existential. The North's future pointed toward modernity and free labor. The South's pointed backward to hierarchy and human ownership. The Fugitive Slave Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, and finally, John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, each event widened the gulf. Trade could no longer hold the two halves together. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, the Southern states saw it not as a political shift, but as an economic threat. If slavery ended, so would their wealth, their identity, their power. And so, in defense of an economy built on human bondage, they seceded. The Civil War was, in many ways, a war over the American economy: who would control it, and what kind of labor would sustain it. The Confederacy bet on cotton diplomacy, believing Britain and France would intervene to protect their textile industries. But they miscalculated. By 1863, global markets had found alternatives: Egyptian and Indian cotton. King Cotton had lost its crown. Meanwhile, the North's industrial power surged. Railroads, ironworks, and factories supplied the Union armies. The same engines that once wove Southern cotton now produced weapons of war. When the smoke cleared in 1865, slavery was abolished, the plantations were shattered, and the Southern economy lay in ruins. Yet out of that devastation, a new kind of America began to emerge, one built not on bondage, but on industry, innovation, and a broader, if still imperfect, vision of freedom. The seeds planted in the colonial era, tobacco, cotton, and trade, had grown into a mighty and terrible tree. Its roots reached deep into the nation's soil, nourishing both its wealth and its sins. The tobacco fields of Jamestown had given birth to the plantation system. The cotton gin had turned slavery into an empire. And the trade routes once filled with tobacco barrels had become arteries of global commerce. Even after emancipation, the patterns endured. Sharecropping replaced slavery, keeping millions in poverty. Northern industries continued to profit from southern raw materials. The echoes of the colonial economy lingered in every factory whistle and every bale of cotton shipped abroad. The story of America's early economy is the story of its soul, of ambition and contradiction, of creation and destruction. It's a story of people who dreamed of freedom and people who were denied it, yet whose labor built the foundations of a nation. From the first tobacco leaf dried in Virginia to the last cotton bale shipped before the Civil War, the pursuit of prosperity defined the American experiment. It was an experiment that tested the meaning of liberty, and forced the nation to decide what kind of wealth was worth fighting for. And so, when we look at the fields, the ships, and the mills of early America, we see more than economics, we see the birth of a country, forged in labor and contradiction, forever chasing the promise of freedom that began, long before it was complete. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.